Welcome, dear listener, to Wednesday Wandering with me, Cate Field. Wandering about stuff, not just wandering off. This is our weekly pause, a quiet breath, a gentle companion through the turning seasons. Today is July the 3rd. We are standing, you and I, at a threshold. The year has tipped past its halfway point, the solstice is behind us, the days are long and filled with ripening light here in the northern hemisphere. Yet something stirs, a subtle shift, a turn in the air, like the first sense that fruit is ready or that the tide is beginning to turn. Thresholds, I think, are sacred. Not only in ritual or in religion, but in the quiet spaces of our lives, those uncertain, beautiful moments when we move from one way of being into another, between knowing and not knowing, between what was and what might be. And as we stand in this moment, I'd like to invite you into the world of Emily Dickinson, one of my favourite poets and a great observer of thresholds. She lived most of her life in Amherst, Massachusetts, in a large white house called the Homestead. She was a devoted daughter, a sister, a gardener, and a reclusive observer of life. Dickinson lived quietly, but her mind was amazingly bold. Although she published only a handful of poems in her lifetime, she wrote nearly 1,800, and they were discovered after her death, bound in little fascicles, stitched by her own hand, a bit like a seamstress making a book of hymns. She often dressed in white, tended her conservatory of exotic plants, and wrote her poems on scraps of paper, backs of envelopes, the corners of notes. She explored the edges of death and divinity, of love and longing, of absence and presence. And one of her best known lines comes from her poem about possibility. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose more numerous of windows, superior for doors. She saw poetry and perhaps life itself not as something to be explained or pinned down, but something to be entered, walked through, lived in, a house with many windows, with doors flung open. Emily Dickinson never married. She corresponded widely with editors, friends, family, and even a mysterious master whose identity has long been speculated upon. And some found her poetry baffling, eccentric, elliptical, steeped in dashes and slant rhyme. But others, like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, one of her early mentors, he recognised in her a startling originality. He once said reading her letters was like drinking wine with teaspoons. She wasn't widely known in her lifetime, but after her death, her work began to ripple outwards, and poets like Adrienne Rich and Sylvia Plath and Mary Oliver have all acknowledged her influence, her courage to dwell in ambiguity, her unflinching attention to the interior world, her radical voice in a time when women's voices were often silenced. She was, in a quiet way, a threshold herself, standing between the known and the unknowable, between 19th century constraint and 20th century poetic freedom. And perhaps it's no coincidence that today, the 3rd of July, is also the feast of St. Thomas the Apostle, forever known as Doubting Thomas. But I'd like to offer another name for him, Seeking Thomas. Because when the risen Christ appeared to the disciples, Thomas wasn't there. And he refused to believe secondhand. He needed to see, to touch, to encounter. And Christ met him there, not with rebuke, but with an invitation. Put your finger there and see my hands. And this moment, this reaching out to touch the wound, has inspired countless artists through the centuries. Probably most famously Caravaggio's dramatic painting, The Incredulity of St. Thomas, because it captures that moment when Thomas touches Christ's side, his brow furrowed in awe, his finger deep in the wound, as if to confirm, yes, it's real, and yes, I believe. And artists have loved this scene because it embodies our doubt, our faith, our flesh, and mystery, all in one gesture. Writers too have been drawn to St. Thomas. W.H. Auden once wrote of the disciples longing for truth, seeing in him the very human refusal to accept comfort without evidence. Thomas speaks to those of us who can't quite take things on faith alone, and who ask questions, who long to touch what is true. He's not a failure of belief. He is in many ways, I think, the most honest embodiment. So let's return to this moment, the 3rd of July, a quiet, unspectacular day on the calendar, yet a day filled with meaning. We stand at thresholds, like Emily Dickinson with her pen poised between silence and speech, and like St. Thomas, his hand hovering between uncertainty and trust. And perhaps, like them, we are invited not to leap forward, but to dwell in this space, to honour it, to listen, and to wonder. So today, I invite you to pause, perhaps light a candle, or sit on your front step, or pause in a doorway and write a few lines about where you are now. Not where you wish to be, but ask yourself, what am I stepping away from, and what is happening right now? What am I stepping into, and where am I right now? Can I linger here a little longer and trust that what I need will arrive? We don't have to be certain. You don't have to be ready. You simply have to be present to the turning. As Emily Dickinson said, forever is composed of nows. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next week for another gentle wandering. Take care. Bye-bye.